All right, good evening, everybody. I'm going to turn this other microphone on. One moment. Okay. Well, thanks so much for having me out tonight. I'm really excited to be here. Most of you, I've probably seen or read your names on the CoBirds listserv, but have never really made it down this far to get to meet you in person. So I'm glad to have the chance to do that and to talk to you a little bit about what I've worked on for the last 5 years or so over the course of my graduate experience. I just wanted to start off by giving you a little bit of background about myself, since I haven't gotten a chance to know you very well. And I'll start out just how I got into birding and got into this field in general. I definitely grew up in a very suburban background right outside of Philadelphia, and I didn't have a whole lot of exposure to the outdoors as a kid. My parents liked birds, they fed birds, but they weren't particularly birders, or weren't particularly interested in doing anything outdoors. I didn't camp or hike until I got to college, and I didn't know that you could be a wildlife biologist as a career until then as well. I actually started out at Virginia Tech thinking I would go to vet school because that's the only way I knew how to study animals. And I started as a chemistry major, and I found the Wildlife Society group that was part of the student body there. Immediately switched my major, and the rest is, as they say, history. There was also a really great group of local birders there that kind of took me under their wing and taught me everything they knew. So I really got my start birding when I was an undergrad. And I was lucky enough to travel all over the world doing different field jobs, starting out in Alaska, working on spectacled eiders. This emperor goose picture is from up there. And before I got to college, I actually used to go to Cape May, New Jersey quite a bit as a kid. And I got to see some of the interpretive naturalists there talk about the raptors that they were catching, and really the peregrine falcons that they were catching and just put on display as like public, outreach kind of things, were the bird that got me into birds. And I eventually, once I graduated, was able to go back to Cape May and work that same position in band raptors, which is what you see in this picture here, although that's a Cooper's hawk. So it's kind of a cool, like, full circle moment, and really kept my birding interest going. I also got the chance to go to Mongolia for a summer and work on sacred falcons there on a project looking at how their populations were doing, and whether they could take excess of them or a surplus of them for falconry uses. And from there, I was able to get a master's position and move out to Colorado. And that project was in the last few years, it focused on cinnamon teal breeding ecology down in the San Luis Valley. So the folks that just went down there to see the cranes in Zapata Ranch, I've spent quite a few summers living down in the valley in Monte Vista. And it's one of my favorite places in Colorado. And I was lucky enough then to get funding to continue on and do a PhD at CSU, which is what I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about today. And I just finished that this summer and started with CPW. So I'm really excited to keep working on birds, and hope I'll touch on the renewable energy stuff a little bit at the end, but I'm mostly going to focus on my work on waterfowl and their populations up in North Park. So just to kind of give you some context into North Park and the Intermountain basins in Colorado in general, I wanted to zoom out and look at where we're talking about. So we have 4 of these high elevation Intermountain basins throughout Colorado, and they form the headwaters of a lot of our rivers here. So we have North Park up here that forms the headwaters of the North Platte, Middle Park, the smallest of the 4, South Park that forms the headwaters of the South Platte, and then the San Luis Valley, which forms the Rio Grande. These are all fairly high elevation, and what I found was most interesting when I was down in the valley, you can see the sand dunes off in the distance. Thousands to millions of years ago, all of these parks used to be completely filled with water. They were these ancient lakes, and over time they slowly drained into rivers, and they left behind remnant wetlands as well as remnant sand deposits. And then because we have these westerly winds, they blew all of that sand to the east side of the valley and formed what we know now as Great Sand Dunes National Park. And there's actually sand dunes up in North Park as well. They're a little bit smaller, not quite as impressive as Great Sand Dunes, but they are there from those remnant lakes that used to be there. So I'm mostly going to be talking about water today. And I don't know if any of you were able to get the chance to watch the DFO presentation last night with Katie Burke, but if you did, it was, the takeaway was water in Colorado and the West in general is incredibly complex. It's super contentious, and it's going to continue to get more contentious as time goes on. But and that complicates wildlife management decisions that we make in the state and elsewhere. We have these complex water laws like first in time, first in right. So whoever got to this land and settled it first and has that water right that goes back the furthest in time have the most senior water rights. And there's also these abandonment clauses where if water users don't use their full water right and they aren't able to irrigate as much as they're supposed or allowed to, they can eventually lose that water right so that they're not allowed to irrigate at all. And that comes into play quite a bit with the flood irrigation that I'm going to be talking a little bit about. So this really just complicates how we allocate this water if we want to continue managing wildlife habitat, but also have a growing human population in the state. So because it's such a scarce resource, it's getting scarcer over time. And this figure just shows some of the snow stations that are coming from the North Platte Basin. So these are from the mountains right around North Park. And you can see over the last 30 years or so, the snow water equivalent of snow up in those mountains has decreased by 400 millimeters or so 40 centimeters. So every year it's getting a little bit less, it's getting more variable. And we just have to figure out how to best allocate those continuingly limited resources. There's also quite a bit of research showing that wetland types are changing over time. So because there's increasingly dry conditions, some of those wetlands like big reservoirs, well, not reservoirs are human created typically, but big wetlands that were a little bit more permanent that stayed around for year after year are getting drier, and they're kind of transitioning to a little bit more ephemeral or temporary wetlands. So that might be good for some species like plovers or things that use the edges of these temporary wetlands. But for some species like bitterns that maybe need something that's a little bit more permanent, there's going to be less of that habitat around. And then regardless of how scarce water is, it's always been a complex resource to move across the landscape. People spend their entire careers trying to figure out exactly how to do that. And there's so much funding that goes into it. There's federal and state grants that people try to get, excuse me, to try to just move water around the landscape, whether it's for humans or for wildlife use. And that happens in different ways throughout the state. So the two areas that I've researched the most are the San Luis Valley and North Park, and the irrigation that happens in those regions is incredibly different. So down in the valley, most of those water resources are underground, which means that they have to pump that water up above ground and use it in sprinklers to irrigate their crops. So you see those big center pivots, which look like this from the air. Whereas in North Park, it's one of the last places really in the state that still uses flood irrigation. So they're essentially just pulling water off of that river and then flooding fields to grow hay. That's the primary crop up there. And then the way we're studying this, we're studying the water and the resources that we have available kind of through the lens of waterfowl. And that's for a few different reasons. First of all, ducks are very charismatic. I've found over the last 8 years of researching them that pretty much anyone you talk to has a duck story. You get on a plane and tell them you study ducks and everybody says, oh, I have mallards that nest in my backyard or land in my pool. So it's a really great way to just connect to other people. They're also a really great umbrella species that people care so much about ducks. People love ducks. And because of that, a lot of funding gets kind of funneled towards them. So when we can protect their habitats, we're protecting the habitats for quite a few other species as well. From just kind of a selfish lens, I got into the wildlife field because I'm really interested in the kind of quantitative mathy side of things. And they're a really great group of species to study population dynamics, how populations change over time, and what are the kind of drivers of those change. And that's also because people just have been monitoring them for such a long time. We've been banding ducks for decades, and we do these huge national, international surveys every single year to monitor duck populations. And because of that, also, their populations are doing so much better than a lot of other birds. I mean, you look at the State of the Birds report that comes out every year, and you see pretty consistently, waterfowl are doing A-okay, and some of the other species like grassland birds are just tanking everywhere you look. So I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from that, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And as I said, most of that is because there's so much funding going towards their habitat. And a lot of that funding in this area is is going towards flood irrigation. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. And that's mostly coming from organizations like Colorado Parks and Wildlife, like Ducks Unlimited, who go in and they create these relationships with private landowners and they help them irrigate, with the theory being that if we help private landowners irrigate, that's going to create more habitat for ducks, and that should be a good thing. Their thinking is kind of along those lines because there's been this really strong narrative over time that flood irrigation is a good thing for ducks. There are organizations like the Intermountain West Joint Venture that really tells this story that we have to keep flood irrigating. We don't want to switch over to center pivots because it's creating more wetlands for ducks. There's the last remaining wetlands on the landscape. And there's lots of stories in Oregon and in California where rice agriculture, which is flooded in the winter, creates like some of the only food resources that's out there for wintering pintail and for other wintering ducks. And it's been a really great success story. So we kind of wanted to test that and see if that was the case here, because we're spending so much money on it and we want to know, should we keep doing that essentially? Yeah, so like I said, most of that money is going towards either restoring irrigation infrastructure or preserving more of the water so that ranchers can continue to irrigate. So this region is not only tough for ranchers to kind of continue irrigating and eke out a landscape, it's also kind of a tough place to study waterfowl. Most waterfowl research that goes on in the country happens up in the prairie pothole region, so the Dakotas and eastern Montana. That's where most of the wetlands that ducks use for breeding are, and kind of we consider it the duck factory. Not a whole lot of breeding duck research happens here in Colorado, and it's just not, it hasn't been done a whole lot in the past. However, we think it is actually pretty important on just kind of a regional scale. So of the birds that we put bans on up in North Park that go on to get harvested by hunters, 70% of those are harvested within Colorado. So we know that the ducks that are produced here are a pretty important resource just, you know, for our state's duck hunters and providing them a good experience, but also just for producing the ducks that exist in this region for us to look at as well. So I'm going to be focusing in here on North Park. So North Park is this high elevation basin. It consists mostly of this sagebrush steppe where we have abundant sage grouse, and it also has the tributaries of the North Platte River. So all that green in there are those different tributaries. It's mostly public land, and the largest parcel of public land is Arapahoe National Wildlife Refuge, which was actually created as a mitigation refuge for land that was being just degraded up in the prairie pothole region. So essentially, those wetlands were being converted to agriculture, to really high intensity row crop agriculture, I think in the 60s. So they said, okay, we need to save some other land elsewhere, and they decided to save it in North Park. Most of the wetlands in this area, however, are private because they are those flood irrigated ranches, and most of them are flood irrigating hay. And that hay is super high quality. It's even gone on to feed the horses that race in the Kentucky Derby. Some places they'll graze cattle in lieu of growing hay, or they'll graze the cattle there after they grow the hay, but cattle is like the primary crop up there, basically. We're growing cattle on these ranches that then go on to feedlots and get consumed by people, and it's very high quality beef. Let's see, they usually hay and cut the hay from about 4th of July into September. It kind of just depends on where they're located in the valley. So the places that are right on the valley floor start cutting earlier, and then as you get up in elevation towards the foothills, they start cutting later and later. I've got a little video here. I'm not sure if we're gonna be able to get that to play, but this just kind of demonstrates what it looks like walking through a hay meadow at its peak. They grow up at eye level. This is a pretty average height human walking through this hay meadow. So the hay is growing super dense and super tall. So it seems like it might be an okay place for a duck to nest. So that's kind of what we were testing. And in this region, ranching is a huge part of the culture, pretty much since the European settlers kind of moved out the last of the indigenous people there. It's been focused on ranching primarily, but there is also more recently quite a bit of oil and gas development. And luckily, we were able to have access to 3 to 5 ranches every year, depending on the year and who wanted to give us access that year. But we were able to see some really incredible sights, including sandhill crane nests. And I have some more pictures of just what we were able to see on some of these ranches, because they're really incredible. And the people that manage these ranches. I mean, it's a total lifestyle, and they're really excellent stewards of the land. They care quite a bit about the wildlife as well as their livestock and crops that they're making their livelihood from. So we've got a couple different kinds of wetland habitats up in here. We have these big storage reservoirs. For anyone who's been up there, we've got Walden Reservoir, we have Hebron Slough, these man-made reservoirs that are meant to store kind of municipally used water. They're typically pretty deep, they're permanent, so they have a different kind of vegetation than something that's going to dry up every year at the end of the summer. So that's something like these basins or ponds. So if you drive around the tour loop on the wildlife refuge, that's kind of what we're looking at for these basin or pond wetlands. They're a little bit shallower. They often have submerged or emergent vegetation. It's typically where you see the most ducks. But then there's also riparian sections, which are one of the more dangerous places to search for duck nests, considering we're doing it at the same times that moose are dropping their calves. And I've had a couple of very scary run-ins with a moose calf that's brand new on the ground, and then I hear crashing through the brush 10 feet away from me. But as you'll see, those are definitely very important areas for ducks as well. Along with that, we've got the irrigation ditches that run off of these riparian sections that then go and flood the hay meadows. And this is just showing us searching one of those hay meadows using a rope drag. However, just to kind of contrast those hay meadows, we also have meadows that are flood irrigated, but they're not cut for hay. So those are typically associated with the wildlife refuge. They're basically being flooded primarily for wildlife, just to grow the vegetation. They're a little bit more diverse in their vegetation community. They're not just this Timothy hay that's growing in the hay meadows. And then these are the most common nesting duck species that we find up there. I'd say most of the nests that we find are cinnamon teal and gadwall for the most part, but all these species are pretty prevalent up there. We have a ton of other water birds that also use North Park during the breeding season. There's quite a couple of colonies of eared and just eared grebes, I think. And yeah, it's very important wetland habitats for many of these wetland species. So I just wanted to go over, before I get into too much of the science of this, some of the cooler sightings that I've been able to have over the last 5 or 6 years up there. So we've seen quite a few hybrid ducks just kind of swimming around. We've caught a couple of them here and there. This blue-winged cinnamon teal hybrid, gadwall mallard hybrid. This gadwall on the top right was one that we caught during our banding operations, and it actually had a prickly pear cactus stuck in its side, like very deep, and it was one of the more satisfying things to be able to pull that out and send her on her way. That bottom left picture is a contrasting picture of a mallard and a Mexican duck, and we actually catch a handful of them usually every year, maybe between 5 and 10. And it seems like it wouldn't be obvious, but then you get them in the hand and you think, why is this mallard so dark, and why does it look like a black duck kind of? So yeah, it's just I didn't know that they came through there during migration, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're breeding up there, but I've never found a nest, and I don't know if I'd be able to tell when they're flushing off of a nest. This bottom middle picture was actually a black-crowned night heron that we saw eating a ruddy duckling, which was one of the more savage experiences I've had in the field. And then a sandhill crane nest. We found 2 of them over 6 years up there, which is kind of rare. We also see quite a few long-eared owl nests. By quite a few, I mean we found like 2 or 3, but that's still a pretty exciting sighting for me. Also keep in mind that the wetland systems are not typically conducive for me to bring a giant camera out into the field. So all of these pictures are digiscoped through my binos, like in my shaky hand. So they're not the greatest, but I usually try to capture them if I can. But that bottom left one is a red-necked grebe. That's only one I've seen up there. And then there's been a couple of red-headed woodpeckers. This one was on a fence post on a ranch, and I went up to the fence post after it flew away and saw that it stuck that bee right into the little crevice there and was just picking at it, which was pretty neat. And then probably my favorite sighting that we've seen in North Park so far was this yellow-billed cuckoo, which was on a super heavily grazed ranch with this little creek going through it where the willows were all dead, and it just happened to be in one of those willows. I think there's been other sightings up there, but that was the most exciting for me. And they're slowly replacing peregrines as one of my favorite birds. And I've been looking at their life history a lot lately, just in this in my new role studying renewable energy, because they're one of the birds that are listed as like a state species of conservation concern. first of all, I didn't know they were nicknamed rain crows, which I think is the coolest bird name, but also they're one of the weirder birds that I've ever read about. There's something weird that goes on with their nestlings where they grow all of their feathers within 2 hours. And I tried to find videos of this, but I don't think they exist. And I'm not really sure where this has been seen, but they're definitely a unique species out there. So one of my favorites. We've also seen one mountain plover and one burrowing owl in the same prairie dog colony, which was pretty exciting. And then the multitude of weird places that geese nest just like never ceases to blow my mind. Always on the tops of these stacks of hay bales, but this one was using an old Swainson's hawk nest in a willow. And then after the Cameron Peak fire, this bottom picture is from 2021. I usually, go back down 14, down Critter Canyon to go back to Fort Collins. And I happened to go on the day that the mudslide happened right through Black Hollow up there after the Cameron Peak fire. And I got there as it started and had to turn around and go all the way back up through Laramie to get home to Fort Collins. So it ended up being like a 6-hour drive, but I wasn't about to stay there for very long and try to see if I could make it through. Okay, so now we got through kind of the fun sightings of the area. I want to get into what we were actually looking at studying up here. And really, we wanted to know what habitats in this kind of system are ducks using and what are the consequences of that? So are they using these hay meadows as nesting areas like we thought? And is it worth continuing to spend so much money helping ranchers irrigate? We kind of looked at this through the context of this sharing versus sparing debate. Have any of you guys ever heard of that or talked about it all? Okay, so basically there's this debate in the conservation community that in terms of agriculture, you can either intersperse wildlife habitat with this kind of low intensity agriculture. So you have a ranch and maybe there's, stands of aspen here, a wetland here within that ranch that provides habitat. So they're not like grazing super heavily or they don't have a feedlot right there, but it's kind of a mixture of the two. And then contrasted to that, move forward, we've got spared habitat. So something like a wildlife refuge we would consider spared. So in a place where there might be super high intensity agriculture, like row crops or cattle in a feedlot, there's a side of the debate that thinks having that kind of higher intensity agriculture on a smaller footprint leaves more land that can then be spared for conservation. So looking at this system through that lens, we wanted to see, are shared lands or spared lands better for waterfowl? And this is just showing what that might look like on one of the ranches. So the hay starts growing in April or May. It's cut in July or August. And once it's cut, it's not flooded anymore. So you get pretty much this 2-inch stubble that's then there until the following spring. So no more grass is growing at the end of the summer. So when birds come back to nest the following year, there's really short vegetation for them. There's not a whole lot of nesting kind of substrate. However, they can't really mow along those irrigation ditches. So this right picture is showing an irrigation ditch right up next to a hay meadow. So you can see there's a little rim of vegetation there that a duck could potentially nest in. However, that might create these linear features that predators could then walk along and easily find nests. So it might kind of create this trap. It looks appealing to a duck looking for a nest site, but it might kind of trap them in there and not actually be great habitat. So to look at this, we searched many, many thousands of acres of nesting habitat, all of which had to be done on foot because we couldn't bring ATVs into some of these wetland habitats or hay meadows. So I think one of our technicians calculated that before they found their first nest, I think last year, they had walked over 150 miles through wetlands. So we get a good workout, that is for sure. And this has now been going on from 2018 to this year. This was our last kind of intensive year, and we'll kind of do some lesser surveys from here on out. We were able to candle the eggs, which is the same thing you do with chicken eggs. So basically look at the egg look through the egg into the light and see kind of the developmental stage of the embryo. And that way we can calculate when the nest was initiated and when it might hatch. And then we monitored those nests until they either hatched or failed, and did some vegetation surveys to see where were they nesting and why. And just to give you an idea of what a nest site might look like, this is actually from down in the San Luis Valley when I was looking for cinnamon teal nests, but this is all Arctic rush or Baltic rush, same thing. And the cinnamon teal nest is right back here. So pretty much your only way to find nests, you're not really able to use like behavioral cues. You pretty much just have to cover ground. You need as many bodies on the ground as possible, and you're just hoping to flush those birds off the nest when they're incubating. So what we found from all of that, over 6 years, we found almost 200 nests, which, just to put in some context, is pretty much nothing. If you're doing a nesting study in the prairies, you're finding hundreds of nests every month, pretty much. I mean, there's such higher density of nests up there, and it's just a really low density system here in North Park. We found that depredation was the main cause of nest failure, and this is a picture we had on one of the picture from the camera we had on one of the nests of a raven, which was really our primary nest predator up there, scaring a shoveler hen off of a nest and then taking all her eggs. And I didn't include a picture of a couple hours later when she comes back, and you can see her just opening her little bill and looking very sad. But a typical nest survival estimates, which just means the probability that at least one of those eggs is going to hatch and be successfully turned into a duckling, essentially. Typically about 20% of the nests were successful, and that's pretty average for ducks across the landscape. So this just kind of shows you the different densities and how low those densities were across the different habitat types, and these results are new as of today, so you're the first ones to see them. But basically, we found that nests were in higher density along those irrigation ditches and in riparian areas than any of the other habitat types. And definitely, they were not high in the hay meadows. I think over the course of 6 years, we found 6 nests in the actual hay meadows themselves. So that was like one of the major takeaways of this, that ducks are really not nesting in these hay meadows as much as we thought they were. They are, however, nesting along irrigation ditches and in those uncut irrigated meadows. So meadows that have a little bit more vegetation substrate that's there from the previous years that doesn't get cut. They really prefer those, it seems like, to hay meadows, and we can kind of use that when guiding conservation funding in the future. But in that kind of context of shared and spared lands, it seems like both of those are really important in this system. And I just wanted to note the different timing of these birds' nesting processes. So this kind of shows the order that they typically nest in up there. Mallards are definitely the earliest nesters. They'll start nesting at the end of April when there's still snow on the ground. So if you're a mallard getting there in April, there's not going to be any vegetation in those hay meadows. It's just kind of that short stubble, probably either covered in snow or covered in sheet water as they start to irrigate. So really, your only options are going to be places that had vegetation the previous year that you can kind of burrow into, or willows along riparian sections. And we find quite a few mallard nests along those willows. Cinnamon teal get a little bit later into the summer, starting in June, maybe into July, and that's when a lot of vegetation has greened up and they have access to those spots. And then gadwall and scaup really don't even start nesting until July. They're super late. Gadwall often nest under greasewood or different kind of shrubs, and scaup will nest over water, but really focused on vegetation that's greened up and grown pretty dense. And then one other kind of just anecdotal result we found from this, which was really exciting, but we couldn't do a whole lot with it. Part of the study was supposed to be focused on movement. So basically we saw all of these ducklings in these big reservoirs. We knew they were coming from North Park, but we didn't know where they were coming from. And we didn't know how they were getting to these reservoirs. I mean, they're not flying and they're probably not walking, although, you know, mallard ducklings can walk a decent amount or decent ways. So we wanted to put transmitters on some of the birds and see how they were moving around the valley. And this is just one example of that. So this is the highway that splits off at the north end of North Park. And if you go left there, you're going to Encampment, Wyoming. If you go right there, you're going up to Laramie. But on the right side of this highway is part of the wildlife refuge. And on the left side is a big ranch. And this duck, I don't know how to show this on here, but this top right yellow part is where the duck had a nest. It's a mallard, and it was nesting in a little willow up here. And then once her ducklings hatched, I'm going to zoom in on this. This was her nest. And you can see there's a little irrigation ditch that kind of goes all the way over here under the highway through a culvert, and then over to this big wetland system in the river that's on this ranch. So she basically took her ducklings all the way down there through the ditch and used that ditch as kind of like a little highway to get to the better wetland sites. So we think that those irrigation ditches are playing a role in helping birds move around the landscape. And we didn't find any like detrimental impacts of on their nest survival or anything. So, you know, even though we're using them for human purposes, they do seem to be valuable for waterfowl as well. Okay. So we know where ducks are nesting, we know why and what are the consequences of that. We wanted to see what else might these hay meadows provide. If they're not really providing that great of nesting habitat, maybe they are providing some foraging habitat. We wanted to see how that compared to other wetlands. So we looked at what ducks are eating during the summer. And typically that's quite a few invertebrates. During the non-breeding season, ducks are mostly focused on seeds and getting lots of carbs. But during the breeding season, they need lots of protein. They're producing lots of eggs. And then the ducklings need pretty much exclusively invertebrate protein as they're growing very rapidly. So we wanted to know which habitats provided the most invertebrates and how did that kind of change throughout the course of the summer? And do birds know where those are and can they track it? So to do that, we put out our super high-tech invert traps, which were just 2-liter soda bottles that we cut the top off of. You just invert that like a little funnel, and you stick it in a wetland for 2 days, and then you take that back to a lab and kind of process it, sort through all those samples. Took a small army of technicians. So it's many, many hours looking through a microscope at pink little inverts that are dyed in there. But we counted them and sorted them and identified them down to scientific family to try to get at what ducks were eating. At the same time that we were collecting those samples, we did that every 2 weeks, 2 weeks over the course of the summer for 2 different years. And at the same time, we were also counting ducks. So we counted pairs of ducks during the early season and then ducklings once those started hatching. And we wanted to compare those to the number of inverts that we found in the wetlands. And basically what we found is that there's quite a bit of variation. We found over 125 different families of invertebrates. Some of the cooler ones that we found, actually these both came from the same sample along the river on Arapahoe National Wildlife Refuge, but it's a hydra, which if you haven't read about them, they're well known to be considered immortal. They don't die from natural causes. And then also a tardigrade, which are just cool little water bears. Basically, we found that there was a higher density of invertebrate energy available to ducks in ponds and reservoirs compared to some of those other wetland habitats. So it's kind of intuitive if you go out there and look at which habitats, which wetlands have the most vegetation in them, it's going to be those ponds and those reservoirs, whereas rivers and the irrigation ditches that come off those rivers, you know, it's super high oxygen, it's cold water, it's not a lot of like substrate for those invertebrates to reproduce on essentially. And that's exactly what we found. So higher water temperatures and some of these other water chemistry metrics that we measured were really characteristic of those ponds and the reservoirs, which is where we found the most inverts. These are just some of the other cool ones that we found over the course of 2 years. When we looked at that, at how ducks were then tracking that, we saw what we were expecting to see, that the ponds that had more energy available to ducks is where we saw more ducks. But the thing that was interesting about this was we saw that relationship was stronger early in the summer. So when ducks really needed lots of protein, when they were starting to get ready to nest and getting their eggs or producing their eggs, that's when they're really focused on protein and building those reserves. And that's when they were really honing in on the wetlands that held more inverts for them. As for broods, pretty much it didn't matter when that was happening. They were really honed in on those wetland types that had more inverts available to them. So we think that might be an important piece of the puzzle here, and that the kinds of wetlands that produce the most energy for both of these different life stages can then be the focus of conservation. So yeah, I mean, we pretty much learned, we know that North Park creates a lot of mosquitoes, which is what these larvae are. And every single hay meadow you looked at was just teeming with mosquito larvae. And after working in Alaska, I can confidently say that North Park is worse in terms of mosquitoes than anywhere in Alaska that I've been. We've had technicians cry because the mosquitoes were so bad. But they do provide duck food, so there is that. But I think what we learned from this is that you kind of have to consider not only what resources these habitats might provide in terms of nesting, but also in terms of food and what's available during their different life stages. Okay, so just kind of one final piece of this puzzle. I wanted to look at how this population compared to the overall continental population of ducks. No research really happens in this Intermountain West region, so we don't really know if their survival or their reproduction is all that different from the ducks that we monitor up in the prairie potholes. So I was able to kind of take a look at that population and see what those how those vital rates, like survival and reproduction, differed. This map is just showing where the transects are that are monitored every year for ducks, and you can see they're all up in prairie Canada, some in Alaska, some in the east, and then on the prairie potholes. So Colorado is not encompassed in that. So we don't really have a great idea if our ducks are any different. And basically, we came to the conclusion that they're not really all that different. And that's a good thing, because we can then use the estimates from like the larger continental population to then manage this population as well. But one thing I did want to note is that this system seemed very sensitive to environmental conditions in the spring. So these are showing basically their reproduction, their recruitment. So how many birds they're putting into the population, the breeding population, the following year. And this is showing how much their population is growing over time. They kind of mirror each other, they completely mirror each other. And you can see that they're lowest in 2019, which was one of the wettest years we've had in quite a long time. This picture was in June, and on the first day of summer in North Park, we got 8 inches of snow. So there wasn't a whole lot of nesting habitat available, because it never stopped snowing until the end of the summer. Because of that, there weren't great reproductive rates, and birds just didn't seem to do that well. Compared to 2020, which is right when the Cameron Peaks fire started. This is the picture from North Park on the other side of the mountains. And they're starting to do a little bit better because there was some water early in the season. Even though that dried up towards the end, it seemed to like that those spring conditions were really what was driving their success. So kind of the takeaways from this is that it's kind of this boom or bust system. It really depends on what the climatic conditions are doing every year. And that will kind of drive how this population is then contributing to the overall regional population of ducks. So just kind of some major takeaways and how I think about the results of all this coming together is that we had this really strong narrative that flood irrigation was especially important for breeding ducks, and that we need to keep helping ranchers irrigate because those are the last wetlands on the landscape and ducks are using them. And that might be the case for wintering ducks. It might just be a little bit more nuanced than that. We kind of contradicted the fact that they're really beneficial during the breeding season, and that they need other habitats that are a little bit more diverse and have a little bit more like vegetation from the previous years. And then we also found that the timing of how we put these resources on the landscape is more important than just putting them out there. Those spring conditions are important, and having wetlands available at the end of the summer when some of them start drying up is going to be really important for those broods that need inverts at that time. Some of the kind of, I don't know, harder to think about topics that I've definitely taken away from this project are just how important is ranching as a conservation tool. I mean, we hear all the sorts of stories in the media about, cattle being terrible for climate change, but when you see the management that goes on the ranches, especially in this region, most of the ranchers that are out there are just excellent land stewards. And if they weren't ranches, what would they be instead? I don't know if they would be, protected habitat. Maybe they'd be developed into subdivisions. And is that the last remaining habitat out there? And how can we better help them to manage that in a way that's beneficial? And to keep their water rights so that it is creating habitat that's beneficial. And then just studying ducks for such a long time, I really do think about how successful conservation of waterfowl has been and how we might use some of those lessons for things like grassland birds. It's got a really, really passionate funding base in waterfowl hunters and just people who are passionate about ducks, because so much funding is coming from hunting licenses and whatnot. And I know there's been conversations for years about how to kind of tap into that from other user bases. But I think there's definitely lessons to be learned to kind of help leverage that kind of funding for other species. And I think all of this can really just guide where we're putting our wetlands. I mean, these wetlands that were created in North Park were used as mitigation wetlands for land that was degraded in the prairie pothole region. So sometimes we don't have a lot of choice over where that happens, but is that the best place for putting new wetlands when we're destroying wetlands elsewhere? Or is there a way to kind of guide where those are then created that is going to be the most beneficial to birds? So my next project that I'm kind of been tasked with at CPW is focusing on the impacts of renewable energy on birds. So I'm kind of just starting out to see where are our species of conservation concern in the state, where are their distributions, and how are those overlapping with proposed wind and solar sites. This is going to be, it's a really controversial topic, I think, because we really need those energy resources to, step away from fossil fuels, but also we have the chance to do that in a really responsible way and kind of inform where those are placed on the landscape with birds in mind. And then I'm also hoping at some point in the future to get some kind of forest bird project. There's been a lot of talk of evening grosbeaks in the recent past because they don't seem to be doing particularly well and nobody really knows why. So I'm really hoping to kind of leverage eBird data and just kind of dig into that a little bit and see what we can find out about them. I have a lot of people to acknowledge, but I also always like to take a second to acknowledge the land that I worked on. I think I spent a lot of time trying to take what I needed out of this system, and it only took a couple years of field work not going how I planned to really knock me down a peg and just take a step back and look at what the system was kind of trying to tell me rather than the other way around. And I think this quote from Braiding Sweetgrass really puts that into perspective. And then I also want to thank many of the people who helped make this project possible, both at CSU and at CPW and Ducks Unlimited, and the many private landowners who were gracious enough to give us access to their ranches. They're really doing the work out there. So hopefully I have a little bit of time for questions, and I'm happy to chat about any of this a little bit more with you guys. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, or is the mic on? Because if you have a question.
Thank you. I have 3 quick questions. You mentioned reservoirs as being productive up there for waterfowl. Here in Boulder County, they're just sinks.
Mm-hmm.
There's no nesting, almost no nesting in Boulder Reservoir and the big reservoirs because of the fluctuating water levels. That's my first question. How is it different? Second is, what about bull snakes on the Western Plains? Bull snakes are often the #1 predator on waterfowl nests. Do you have fewer bull snakes up there? And the third question is, why are pintails doing so poorly nearly everywhere?
Oh man, okay. Let's see. So reservoirs, we definitely found that they weren't the most productive nesting habitat. There typically wasn't a whole lot of vegetation, like a ring of vegetation around the edges. Up there, it's typically sagebrush right up until the edge of the reservoirs. But they were super important in terms of foraging. So at the end of the summer, all of the ducklings congregated on those reservoirs, and they were just, we found the most inverts in there by far. So yeah, productive for certain aspects of their life history. And then no snakes up there, as far as I can tell. I've seen a couple of garter snakes, but no bull snakes ever. I think it's just a little too high for them. Yeah, too cold. But yeah, I think the primary predators are different everywhere. And we know ravens are increasing because they're kind of subsidized by human settlements and structures. But in sagebrush habitats, those seem to be the biggest issue. And then pintail, there's a whole lot of thoughts on why pintail are doing so badly. I think one of the reasons is that they really like to nest in some of those agricultural fields up in the prairies, especially alfalfa. Yeah, they're an early nester, so they get in there into these alfalfa fields, which are then harvested and their nests are destroyed. So that's kind of that trap habitat. What else? Okay.
If you look at the breeding bird survey data, all the dabblers, most of them are increasing.
Yeah.
The North American pintails are just going down like this.
Yeah, pintail and canvasback and scaup are just not doing so hot for a multitude of reasons.
Thanks.
I'd like to introduce you to Sandra Larson on the screen. Sandra, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks, Carol. Zoomers, do you have any questions?
She's in charge of the Zoom.
Thanks for joining us on Zoom.
We appreciate your talk. Thanks very much. don't see any hands right now, so we'll kick it back to the room and let folks collect their thoughts and see if a question comes up.
Okay, looks like we got one here.
Megan? Thank you. So this may have been in the data table and I missed it, but you, in the beginning of the hypothesis or the idea that those narrow irrigation ditches and the habitat along them could potentially be highways for
Mhm.
predators and things. Did you find a difference in the predation rates on nests between the different habitats? I don't remember seeing it.
Yeah, no, I didn't really display that very well. No, it didn't seem, well, okay. First, I want to say the caveat that we pooled all of our species together to kind of estimate nest survival. And there's probably differences there between across species. We just didn't have enough nests to look at that. But no, we didn't see anything that was like majorly driving nest survival. It seemed like nests that were near the irrigation ditches did just as well as nests that were in a meadow somewhere. It just seemed like they were selecting those ditches more like disproportionately to what was available.
What about the impact of your presence on nest survival and whether you noticed any difference in terms of attracting predators when you had found nests and messed around with them?
Yeah, that's definitely a great question. We tried our very hardest not to trample vegetation. That was the biggest concern of these wet meadows. You go in, and as soon as you take a foot or take a step, you have a footprint there in the grass. So if we found a nest, we got out of there as soon as possible. And when a hen flushes, what they typically do is cover that up with down when they leave. So when we found a nest, we'd cover it back up with down, and then we put a little grass X on top of it so that we can tell, did that bird actually come back there? Or if she abandoned the nest, did she come back and then abandon it, or did she abandon right after we flushed her off? So we could kind of get an idea for the most part of whether we were causing her to leave, and if we did, then we didn't include those in the analyses. And it didn't happen that often. I don't have a percentage or anything like that, but it wasn't as bad. I mean, we tried everything we could to make that not happen. I definitely think we only put cameras on a couple of nests, but they typically had a little post there, and those I think that ravens were attracted to those. They can kind of follow you around and look where you're going. But for the most part, we didn't find any differences in nest survival associated with us in particular.
Sandra, do you have anybody?
Zoom folks, any questions?
Yeah, I guess all of your conclusions are based on 190 nests. I just wonder what that does, and so there are all kinds of caveats about. So is there some kind of comparable research elsewhere so you can see if it's kind of consistent or?
Yeah, there's a lot of research out there on nesting ducks success and habitat selection, and our results are pretty consistent with most of what's out there. The nest survival is pretty comparable, but yeah, I mean, our kind of sampling frame is just nests in these areas that we sampled of the species that we found. So there are a lot of caveats. We've done some kind of power analyses to see how many we have to find to be able to estimate nest survival, and we're at least over those thresholds for the most part. We just can't split that up too much, by species or by habitat type as well as we'd like to.
I'm curious if there anything that can be done to the irrigation ditches that make them more like the pound and stuff.
More beneficial?
Yeah.
One thing we've talked about with Ducks Unlimited is potentially basically incentivizing leaving a little bit of a buffer along those irrigation ditches so that there's a little bit more nesting habitat there and a little bit more protection if predators are walking along them. And that's something that they're actually starting to implement in some management plans up there. We don't have a test of whether that's actually effective, but we think that it might be. and as well as just keeping water in them as late as possible so that ducklings can actually use them to move around from across different wetland types. Because a lot of times as soon as they stop irrigating, those ditches will dry up and then they're not really habitat so much anymore.
Anybody else in the room? Roomers? Sandra, any Zoomers? Have you been successful in suggesting those kinds of strategies to any of the ranchers on whose land you worked?
That's kind of, we do that through Ducks Unlimited. They're the ones kind of with those relationships. So we suggest that into their management plans, and then they're the ones who kind of talk to the ranchers and implement that. And some of the other, we're working on kind of informational materials right now that are hopefully going to be out by early next year. Just as suggestions to ranchers, if they want more ducks on their property, you know, maybe fence riparian areas so there's not cattle in there trampling any nests that are there, or buffering some of the hay meadows so there's some kind of residual vegetation. We haven't really implemented a lot of it yet, but it's definitely in the works.
It seems to me when you're out there, you have a lot of credibility because you've seen these folks and they've seen you.
Mm-hmm.
And that direct conversations with the ranchers while you're there about what you have found and how their management of the land affects and the kinds of things that you just told us would be really effective, just because you're credible. They've seen you out there. They know who you are.
Yeah.
And that, it seems to me, a missed opportunity to wait till after you're not there to start educating the landowners.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we definitely have conversations with them throughout this whole process, and they're super interested in what we're doing. But for the most part, they're out there tending their cattle and like just, you know, they don't want to have anything to do with us while we're out there. But that being said, we do go to there's the basin roundtables that are the ones who implement the water plan for Colorado. And I've gone to those and talked to those to allow any of the ranchers to come and listen in on some of those results. So we're doing some of that too. It's just, you know, it's how it goes.
I had a question about beaver.
Oh yeah.
And are they up there in North Park? And
they are, and that's become quite a hot topic these days. I think the wetlands that are especially associated with the wildlife refuge typically historically would have been beaver ponds, but then now are man-made ponds. And you know, the ranchers don't love them because they block up their irrigation ditches and their stream sections and make it harder to irrigate. But I think some of them are really starting to see the benefits of them to just like water recharge, and some of them are starting to even have beaver restoration projects going on the ranches. So it's getting there. And I think that's a big push among some of the conservation community.
Anybody else in the room here? Sandra?
I don't see any questions. I do see, or unless Therese, did you unmute to ask a question?
I did unmute, and sorry, I can't figure out how to raise my hand or anything else on this one right now. So my question is, what is your work going to be like on assessing bird impacts of renewable energy? And what I recently learned is there is basically a renewable energy transmission corridor in Colorado that looks like a reverse C on the plains. And my question, and in the presentation I recently heard that that's already kind of outlined, and they hadn't asked CPW first. So my question is, how is your research going to help CPW analyze and make appropriate recommendations for the renewable energy transmission corridor?
That is an excellent question. And I anticipate nonstop questions like this over the course of my career. I just want to qualify this by saying that I just started in July, and I'm very much still kind of diving into this topic and how it all works in the state. I just went to this coalition meeting of different conservation groups and utility companies and developers talking about how we can all work together to kind of site these in a responsible way with conservation at the forefront. And I mean, there were some really great takeaways, and I think people are really willing to work together. But as of right now, there's not a lot of requirements for developers other than threatened and endangered species and bald and golden eagles, which are, federally regulated. They typically developers will come and ask for recommendations, either for like mitigating effects or where we should cite them, but they don't have to. So it depends on a developer or utility basis and whether they want to do that. And I think that's what I'm going to be diving into. So I don't have a great answer for you yet, other than the fact that my job will be to inform them should they want to come and ask.
Yeah. So is it a done deal that the reverse C is going to be created? Or are there still tweaks that could be made using your research?
I don't know specifically for that project. I know there are some transmission lines that have already, like the land is leased and permits are being started, but I think a lot of times permitting processes fall through for a variety of reasons. So I don't think they're done deals until they're like being developed. I don't want to speak out of turn, and I don't really know for sure.
Well, good luck. We hope you do a good job.
Thank you. I'm happy to hear all of your thoughts and opinions. All right, thanks all.